For most Ashkenazi Jews, when we think about a scribe writing a Torah scroll or a mezuzot or a tefillah, we imagine them writing with a quill made from a feather. That's going to be the flight feather, usually of a kosher bird, like a goose or a turkey. That is a relatively recent development in the scribal arts. The traditional tool that was used historically was a reed pen. And Sephardi and Mizrahi scribes generally do still use reed pens. The Talmud in Ta'anit 20a and 20b talks about why we prefer to use a reed pen, and that is because of its flexibility, which should remind us to be emotionally flexible. The Talmud there relates the story of Rabbi Elazar and the Ugly Man, which, if you've never read, I highly recommend. And the moral of the story is to be flexible, and Rabbi Elazar that then teaches that we should use the reed to write Torah scrolls because God wants us to is one very important reason, but another is God wants us to because the reed is so flexible. And in fact, around the Jewish world, reed pens were used to write Kedusha, at least until the Middle Ages. We have, for example, the poem Akdamut or Akdamos, which is read on Shavuot, where the poet records, if all the seas were ink, and if all the forests were reeds, and if all of the firmament were gvil, which is a type of parchment, and all of us were scribes, still we couldn't write God's praises fast enough. And the key point there being that even in the 11th century in Germany, we kind of took it for granted that people were writing with reeds. The feather quill is a relatively recent technology. It was developed around the 6th century in Spain. The reed pen is a much older technology. It's about 7,000 years old. And it is as old as ink and parchment. The three technologies that developed more or less simultaneously that enabled writing in the sense that we have it today, which is depositing ink on a surface. And so, for example, all of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written with reed pens. So with that, let's talk about how to cut the reeds. You've got a couple of options. You can, depending really on what you have available to you, if you have reeds available that are like nice and pencil shaped to begin with, that they've got, the right diameter and the links aren't too close together, then you can use a round reed. If what you have is wider around like this, you're going to need to split it. You can use any kind of hardwooded reed, like river cane, but really these days, when we have access to any kind of reed we can imagine, the best reed to use is going to be bamboo, because it's just really tough. So it'll hold a point for much longer, and you can get a finer point on it. Also, in many parts of the world, including in most of North America, bamboo is invasive. So if your neighbor or your local park has bamboo growing in it, then you can help the world out a little bit by harvesting and using it. And in fact, that's where all of this bamboo came from. It came from a park near my parents' house in Norman, Oklahoma, where there's an overgrown patch of bamboo, and every time I need pens, I go and cut some down. So if you've got, this sort of round variety, you're going to want to cut in one dimension at about a 15-degree angle. You can whittle it away with a box knife, or what I've done here is I have just used a laser cutter. That's the cheater's version if you have it. And then you want to turn it 90 degrees this way, and you want to cut a taper on it. That'll get you pretty darn close to your final shape. If you've got one of these situations where you don't have, an obvious way of using the reed as is as a pen, you first have to split it. However you want to accomplish that. This one cracked during harvest, so I can pretty easily just split it by hand. All right, and if not, you're going to need some kind of knife to do this. And this, you really want to be careful if you're splitting it from scratch, because you don't want to get injured by your knife, but you also don't want to get splinters in your hand. And depending on how wide your bamboo starts out, you might split it in half, in a third. If you have really big ones, maybe you get 8 of these pens out of one, maybe more if you got really big ones. But then you can keep splitting, and if you're doing this manually, you'll want to sand these edges so that you don't get splinters in your fingers. But again, these days we have laser cutters, so it's much easier to just cut it to this desired shape using a laser cutter. The dimensions of this are going to depend on simply what is convenient for you. I like to cut about 7 or 8 millimeters kind of width-wise, and then lengthwise between 20 and 30 centimeters. This is something like a 15-degree angle. You don't have to get it precise. I actually have a nonlinear taper here that I've kind of played around with over the years, and I tend to like. If you're working from a split piece rather than from a pencil-like piece, then you only have one cut in this one direction. And then whichever configuration you started with, you're going to do the same sort of final cut by hand with a number 11 scalpel. And you're going to want to shave this down to get it pretty thin. All right, I'm going to stop there, even though I'm probably going to take more off in a minute. And at this point, it can be helpful to fire the reed in your oven at a little bit cooler of a temperature than you would bake bread. So 300 Fahrenheit or so is good, and you want the reed to be fairly removed from your heating element so that you don't just burn the crap out of it. You could also try a lower temperature. You'll have to play around with this a little bit, depending on your oven and your reed. But that helps to melt the resins that are in the reed, and after 10 to 15 minutes, you can take it out of the oven and it will be hardened. And that, again, helps it to hold its point. But you don't want to do that before you cut it, because it just gets to be much harder to cut once you do that. So now that we have whittled it down a little bit, I'm going to show you how I cut as a right-handed person. If you are left-handed, you're going to do the same thing, but in the opposite direction. So you hold the reed in your non-dominant hand, and you place it down, face down, towards your sacrificial surface, which in this case is cardboard. There are actually multiple ways to do this. I'm showing you my favorite way, which involves creating a pen that writes face up. But you can also check out the link that I'm going to put below to a manual by Rabbi Michael Chimi that shows how to make a pen that writes face down. Or you can even do a flush cut, which is used to put in tagin. But I'm showing you my favorite method here. So again, I'm holding the reed in my non-dominant hand. I'm taking my number 11 scalpel in my dominant hand. And I'm cutting a 60-degree angle for the nib. Now, where along the reed you cut depends on what you're writing, how big you want your letters to be. Typically, your letters take up half your distance between lines, and your nib should be about 1/3 the height of the letters, maybe a shade less. So a shade under 1/6 your line height is fairly typical. So if you're writing a mezuzot or a tefillah where the writing is usually pretty small, maybe you cut up here. And if you're writing a Torah, a Megillah, or ketubah where the writing is larger, maybe you cut like up here. For purposes of our demonstration today, I'll do it a little bigger, and so I'm going up here, and again, I'm at a 60-degree angle, not like 30-degree, or, call it whatever you want. You can call this 60-degree and this 30-degree, but the important thing is I'm not quite flush, but I'm also not going super sharp. I'm just going a little bit down this way, and that helps with ergonomics. That helps that I don't have to hold the pen completely perpendicular to the parchment as I write. So I'm going to cut this now. And you should get that nice, satisfying snap. And the tip should come flying off. And that's a sign that you've gotten a nice, clean cut on your pen. So now I'm going to look here, and I see that I need to shave it more, because if you look, this here is the width of my nib. This here is the thinnest feature I can write. It's going to be the legs of my letters if I'm writing in a Shuri Hebrew script. So I want to get that thickness really quite thin, or I am not going to have a fun time getting these letters looking pretty. Now you don't want a whole lot of it thin, just the very tip. You want kind of a gradual little taper. I'd say that's pretty good. Now, if you are just writing a couple of letters at a time, this is plenty. You, if you don't want to constantly dip, which, who does, you can drill a hole right there with just a, power drill, and you can split the reed, and that will give you an ink reservoir. That's fairly difficult to do. Maybe I'll make another video on how to do that. It often involves me throwing away a reed or two, trying to get it right. But we're not gonna get into that today. Let me show you how this writes. And actually, first I'll go back here and I'll show you. See how much thinner my legs can be. My nib width is still the same. When I write, I'm going to hold my pen at an angle to the parchment. You see there's actually a number of levels of angularity here. Hold the pen however turns out to be convenient for you. You'll want to experiment with this a bit. But the essential part is that right here, your nib is sitting flat on the parchment. You're not going to want to like jam it in as you write, but you want it to sit flush so that the whole nib is touching the parchment at the same time. In my case, I'm writing on cardboard. I find that cardboard writes a lot like parchment, so it's a great practice surface. I'm going to dip my pen, kind of get most of the ink off, but not all of it. Again, you're kind of gliding on the surface. You're not jamming your pen in. And you have to promise me not to make fun of my writing, because I know it's not great. I'm going to dip again. And I'll hopefully have another video where we can go over forming different letters using a pen, which is different for some letters from a quill. Well, I hope this helps, and if you all have any questions, drop them in the comment section below.